Gentlemen, I'm wondering if we can go back to whether it was growing up in, Bay Area or Santa Barbara or even as far back as the Midwest, and you just think about what story impacted you the most as children, whether it's a TV show, comic book, novel, and how it sort of formed your love for story early on?
Sure. What I like to think about is the fact that we didn't have a television in my house, so I went over to the neighbor's house, and every year they used to broadcast The Wizard of Oz. And I saw The Wizard of Oz when I was very, very young. I must have been about 4 or 5 years old. And everything was good until we got to the Wicked Witch. Then things got a little bit scary, so I bailed. I said, I can't stay here anymore. I have to go home. So I don't know if it was a traumatic impact, but that story was something that made a huge impact as a kid. And I finally got through watching the movie when I was a little bit older. But but I found that one to be so realistic and terrifying that it made a very, very deep impression.
I used to make cocktails for Margaret Hamilton in my first bartending job in New York City, way back in the late 70s.
Nice. How did she like her martini?
I can't remember what she drank. I just remember how diminutive and tiny she was, and she no longer looked very scary.
Oh, well, good. I hope she was a good tipper, by the way.
She sat at a table.
Oh, okay. All right.
For me, I distinctly remember reading Jack London's Call of the Wild, and tears streaming out the sides of my eyes at the end of the book, and just the power of stories, and that I wanted to relive and wanted to stay in that world. But probably a bigger impression was a weird collection of American history stories, badly illustrated in 3-tone colors. And I rebought the book about a decade ago because it had made such a big impression on me. But in second grade, I started a club of writing presidential biographies and coloring portraits of the presidents. And so that's probably how far back my love of history started.
Ron, just as a side note, you mentioned briefly not having a television, having to go to a neighbor's. Was this out of fear of this new box, or that seemed to be taking America down? Or
I wish I could say that it was that important of a commentary on why we didn't have it. But what happened was the TV broke at a certain point, and then my parents decided they weren't going to get it fixed, and then we didn't get one for another like 11 or 12 years.
My God!
Wow.
So that's how that happened.
Okay.
Because I do remember watching the Flintstones in the basement with TV dinners, but that was, long time ago.
Interesting.
Well, we were without a television as well, and I was born when my father was in medical school, and I don't think we had one when we moved to New Hampshire. And I also remember The Wizard of Oz being the first thing I was aware of, and again, I saw it at a neighbor's house, a guy named Bobby Sachs from Boston, and made a big impression on me. But my dad never really cared about movies or entertainment. I don't think he had grown up with them. And when we moved to Santa Barbara, we got the local channel with the TV antenna, and that was it. And we had a black and white TV for years. And so, I was a late bloomer as well, getting to the movies.
Interesting. Well, I know the two of you met at Carnegie Mellon, I think. Mm-hmm. I want to just go back quickly, actually step ahead. I know, Ron, you were a PA on The Godfather 3.
That is true.
So was that an ambition of yours to be in the film industry? I know you both received a
Sure.
Fine arts degree.
I mean, my background is that I started out as an actor, and I started out as a kid, basically as an actor. From a pretty early age. And the way that I got involved with The Godfather was that not too long out of college, I had auditioned for the movie called The Outsiders and befriended one of the producers of that film. I didn't get in the movie, but I stayed in touch with him. And I remember that I was on a construction job and very frustrated. I was like putting up sheetrock or something. And I called his office in LA and they said, well, he's not here right now, he's in Italy. And I said, oh, is there any way that I could get that number? And they said, sure. And they gave me the number. I called him in Italy and I said, are you doing anything right now? And he said, well, we're about to come to New York and we're shooting Godfather 3 right now. And I said, oh, great. And then it turned out I was laid off my construction job the very week that they came into town. So I said, I'll do anything to work on Godfather. And so I ended up doing extra work and also assisting the producer, and it was a great time.
Wow. And I understand you were on a Larry Fessenden film, one of his first or so?
Yeah, Larry and I were good friends. We met through a playwright who had written the script of his senior film at NYU, Evan McHale, a guy that Ron and I went to college with at Carnegie Mellon. And I played a 50-year-old glass merchant, alcoholic. I was 25 or something.
I was going to say, wait a
And
minute.
it was this epic 5-hour film, which both Larry and I are very proud of. I don't know if anybody else likes it, but yeah, we've been friends for a long time. And I've done several things with Larry.
So going back to Carnegie Mellon, both of you had aspirations to be an actor or to be actors, or you felt that maybe one day you would also make films?
I really wanted to be a stage actor. I really wanted to be a Shakespearean actor. And but yeah, I moved to New York and I really spent a decade going to art house movies and seeing classic cinema and foreign cinema, particularly French and Japanese, and I realized my real love was there. But since I loved history, and I got a little frustrated living in New York, and I very much got into Western history, and I saw 3 documentaries that really turned my head around. One was Ken Burns' The Civil War. One was Ross McElwee's Sherman's March, which was supposed to be this historical story about Sherman's march through the South, but his girlfriend leaves him when he starts making the film, and he tries to date women following Sherman's trail to Atlanta.
Yeah.
And then David Peplow, I think his name is, J. Robert Oppenheimer, The Day After Trinity, about the making of the atomic bomb. And I saw that at Joe Papp's Public Theater, and it just made such an impression on me. Not only did I live to read history, but the way it could be laid out on film was very impressive.
Yeah, so for me, in terms of Carnegie Mellon, I was a young actor, as I mentioned, and I knew that CMU was one of the premier schools to train at, that and Juilliard. I applied for both. I actually got into both, but I ended up going to Carnegie Mellon. And it was an amazing period of time there at Carnegie, because we had, our class was particularly strong and there were some really great people there. Holly Hunter was in our class, and John Wells was around, and Cherry Jones was around. So these were just amazing people that were with us. And in terms of film, I had done a little bit of television before Carnegie as an actor. But I always had an interest in writing, so I'd written some plays and things like that. And I remember that I did write a play at Carnegie, and then I also made my first film at Carnegie. And this was completely outside of the curriculum. This was completely self-motivated, and it was Super 8. And I recently read a little bit about what was going on at the time, because I'd forgotten all about it. But it was like, I don't know, a couple $100 budget, and shot it with friends from class. And I edited it over like a 24-hour period, I remember, on one of those little Super 8 editing machines. And then the audio was on a separate system, completely out of sync. Even though we recorded it at the time that we shot it, there was no way to put the picture and the sound together. And then we had one screening that we played the audio on a separate sound system, and hopefully it lined up, but it was probably out of sync. So it was pretty fun. But that was my first filmmaking experience, and yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Going back to Sherman's March for a moment, I mean, that is what's a 3-hour film, isn't it, or close to it? I think
it could be. I can't remember now. Yeah, it certainly could be.
It's been a few years since I've seen it, but I think that even when he made it at that time, it's pretty similar to what filmmakers go through today, and family pressure and different things. And I highly recommend anybody to see it, because it's, even though it's an older film, it's pretty representative of what
I would think it still holds up. I'm actually overdue to see it again.
Yeah, I kind of want to see it again too. Ron, is this your passion to go to old bookstores or to peruse bookstores and look at different titles, or you just happen to stumble upon Mark's work?
It was purely happenstance. And this was not, I mean, this was like a modern day bookstore. And it was, I was just in a bookstore, and I was browsing books, and there was a stack of new titles on a table, and for some reason I was attracted to go look at this new stack of books that had come in, and I saw a photograph that I'd never seen before on the cover of one of the books, but I recognized one of the people in the photograph was my grandfather. I mean, I knew his face right away, even though he was like 19 or 20 in the picture. And then the title of the book was The Millionaires Unit, and I said, oh wait, I know what that is, because I knew about the story of the first Yale unit from my family, but I did not know the details that Mark Wortman laid out in his book so brilliantly. And so it was a really happy discovery, and it sort of started the whole catalyst of getting the documentary going.
So you had known from your family that he had flown and different things like that, but did you know that a book had been made about him?
I did not know that Mark's book was in the works or was being published. Back in the 1920s, the Davison family, who were the original sponsors of the Yale unit, had a book published, a 2-volume book published, and that was distributed throughout the United States to libraries, that chronicled the history of the Yale unit with their letters and journals and photos. So there was a lot of material in that, but I had not spent much time looking at that at all. And it wasn't really until Mark's book came along that I really learned the details.
So then at what point did you contact Darroch and say, should we make this film? Should we devote over 7 years of our lives to making this movie, and all the interesting things that I'm sure happened during that time?
Right. I mean, I'll tell part of the story, and Darroch can tell part of the story too. For me, it was, I read the book and loved it, because I felt it put me right next to my grandfather back in 1916 as he was going through all these experiences. That's how well the book was written. One of those types of books where you just feel you're there. And Mark Wortman, I got in touch with him. He invited me to a panel in New York, and I asked him, the first question I had for Mark was, is anyone making a documentary about this book? Because I think it's an amazing story. I'd love to see it. And Mark said, no, not to my knowledge, no one's making a documentary. And I said, oh. So that sort of put the bug in my bonnet, as it were, to make the film. And then I approached Darroch about it, but the thing that really sold me on Darroch, I knew that he was a documentary filmmaker and had the experience, of making documentary films. But I went over to his apartment one day, and there were all these old photographs on the wall. I didn't know who these people were, but there were old paintings and old photographs, and I go, yeah, this is the guy. This guy loves history. He loves these old pictures. He'll be perfect for this. But it wasn't a quick sale. And I'll let Darroch pick up on that part of the story.
Yeah, I sort of put the book on my huge stack of reading lists and thought I'll get to it eventually, and Ron would bug me about it, and finally I read it, and he also bought me a copy of the 2-volume history from 1925, and I read that. And I had several other irons in the fire of projects that I wanted to do, and but I didn't have a partner. These were all things that I was doing on my own. And I thought maybe it would be a good thing to work with somebody else. And I looked at it as a rather small film to begin with. Ron said he was going out to the Yale Club for this talk, and he met some of the families, and he said they have collections of photographs that nobody has seen before. And I thought, well, maybe we can get a little money together and we can make sort of a family film using these little photographs and give it to all the families of the first Yale unit members, and let's see what archival material is out there. And I think my biggest concern was figuring out how the story of the first Yale unit fit into World War I and fit into U.S. naval aviation, which was just in its infant stages. And then we got going, and the project looked a little bigger, and I sort of thought, oh, this will take maybe 2.5 years. It'll cost maybe $350,000. And we got our initial grant for $25,000, and we went out to the old Rhinebeck Aerodrome, which is up in the Hudson River Valley. And they put on shows all summer, and I can't remember what time of year it was. Was it spring? Were they just starting their season?
Yeah.
And it was rather rainy. You know, we had one day booked for this thing, and I think we had a little bit of insurance. But anyway, it was a spectacular day. And they could not fly their Sopwith Camel, unfortunately, but they flew their other planes, and we had a variety of skies with sun, with clouds, with some rain, and really had a terrific day, and came home with some airplane footage, which we then started editing into little sections of the film, which we would show around and try and get people interested in our project.
So do you think this is the documentarian's dilemma? You have an idea, you say, well, I have all these other irons in the fire, but this sounds great, and it becomes something much bigger than you initially planned? Do you think that's a common thing?
I don't think it's a dilemma. I think that's really part of the artistic and creative process of putting the film together. And I know of many documentary filmmakers that have started out with a kernel of an idea and watched that idea change and grow. I know Steve James, who did Hoop Dreams, talked about this. He was going to make a little film with his little brother. He was a big brother to this guy. And it turned into rather an epic film about the justice system and child rearing and education. And it was really something. And he said, but you know, I had conceived of it as something completely different. And there were several stages in the Millionaires unit where the project just kept growing. And then in the end, it was really about airplanes and where are we going to get them? How are we going to shoot them? And we really thought that along with telling the very human and emotional story through these guys' letters, that if we could also tell the story about what it took to fly those planes, those would be the two key things that would really engage the audience.
Right. Okay. So not a dilemma in a negative sense. It's more of sort of an epiphany or a challenge. Okay, yeah, great. That's a good way to look at it. Well, I know part of the film, especially in the beginning, you talk about these young men, and they were men of privilege, and that with privilege comes a great sort of responsibility to either rise up or to give back for what they've been given. And I know that's one of your sort of taglines on the website for the film. I'm curious how that works into filmmaking, because you say privilege, duty, and sacrifice. That's kind of a line that you have on your website. How do filmmakers stack up against that challenge or responsibility? If someone's fortunate enough to make a film, whether they've been given grants or they have investors, how does that sort of weave into the filmmaker's experience?
Well, for me, the idea of sacrifice having to do with filmmaking, it really wasn't so much that. I often felt that the gentlemen that we were telling the story about were so dedicated to their cause, and their cause was to serve their country and do what they could to protect the United States. And to do that, they were willing to put this little Air Force together and to join the military when they felt that their country needed them. And I was never really one to serve the country in that way. I was not really interested in joining the military myself, but I felt that this story was very important to get out there. So in terms of, my own service, as it were, I feel like telling this story and allowing people to understand who these young men were and what drove them is something that's worth getting out there and making the sacrifice to make happen. So in that regard, I think a filmmaker oftentimes will be, find something that they feel very strongly about and that they want to convey to an audience. And it's worth making the sacrifice to make that happen.
I was a little worried about the story early on, just because it was about these, most of them very wealthy, privileged guys. And of course, you want to cast sort of a wide net to bring in as much interest as possible in making a film. And I was worried that maybe people couldn't relate to them enough, and trying to talk about that wealthy blue blood society from back then, which really did rule America. And I thought it might be, that it might exclude a lot of potential audience people. But the story really was about the individual initiative of these guys rising to the occasion of learning to fly, supporting their friends, and then joining the war effort. And you could see in the story and from reading their letters that a good number of them got in over their heads. And one guy in particular really was not meant to fly, was not capable at all. But the idea of letting down his friends and of opting out of the unit just was unthinkable to him. And he would really rather die than not try to make the sacrifices that he saw his friends making. And that's what happened. As a filmmaker, again, it comes back to history, not just the fact that I love history, but that I feel like history really grounds us as a society and helps people understand who they are and what their responsibilities are. And I feel like a lot of people in America just don't pay attention to things like that. So if you can make a film, an historical film that really lives, that has a personal story as well as the context of big movements in the world, if you can make that live on film, I think that's a job well done. So that was really the motivating thing for me in the story.
I thought it was interesting that because it also showed about the pressures to sort of fit in, and any young person feels those pressures. You feel them when you're in your 40s, but especially then in that situation. And the one gentleman who was not invited to the secret society, and how that ended up really changing him and putting sort of a chip on his shoulder, but maybe for the better, because he was very driven from that point. So I thought that was really an interesting part to the film, because so much of this was these men were heralded, but then there was the one that was sort of the outcast, and I thought that was actually very interesting.
Yeah,
I wanted to actually know more about him, in that sense, because
the black sheep.
The black sheep, because
who really made something of his short life. It's really moving.
Yeah.
Well, there are two very good collections of letters that he wrote before he died at 24. One to his fiancée, and they were discovered by one of the historians that we interview in the film. He was having dinner with this woman, and she said, well, my grandmother, she has all these letters from this World War I aviator. You might be interested. And they were Kenny McLeish's letters that were under her grandmother's bed. And she didn't marry for 12 years after Kenny died, and stayed, I think, was in love with him all her life. And so Jeffrey found these letters, and he published them through the Navy press in the early 70s, and they make quite an impression. Kenny McLeish, who is the great uncle of our narrator, the actor Bruce Dern, right, which was fun. We were recording Bruce for his narration, and on his phone he brought up a photograph of the house in which he grew up. And it was a huge house. He came from a very wealthy family. He was actually excommunicated from his family for becoming an actor. But he grew up in the same mansion and in the same bedroom as Kenny McLeish. There were these 4 turrets on the house, and he had one of them, and that had been Kenny McLeish's bedroom 100 years earlier, or 50 years before Bruce.
At what point did you reach out to Bruce Dern to become a narrator? How did this all take place?
Well, we got to meet Bruce Dern through one of our advisors on the film, a producer named Fred Roos, who was the guy from The Godfather. He told us that Bruce was related to one of the characters in our story. We did not know that at that time.
I don't know how Fred knew that. I don't know why he would know such an obscure thing, but
I don't know either.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think he knew it because I believe Bruce's middle name is McLeish.
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah.
I think so.
But even then, it's not like Kenny McLeish is a household name.
Right. Exactly.
But
Archibald.
Kenny McLeish's older brother was Archibald McLeish, the poet laureate, and a very well-known writer in America.
Yeah.
Interesting.
In fact, there's a great story. Bruce was ousted from his family, and the only one he was in touch with was Archibald McLeish, because Archibald wrote a verse play called J.B. that Elia Kazan directed on Broadway. And at the time, Elia Kazan had 6 actors under contract. It was Bruce Dern, Geraldine Page, Rip Torn, Pat Hingle, and I can't remember the other one. But, so he was reunited with Archie, and he would have dinner with his uncle quite often. His uncle would catch him up on family business.
Yeah. But Bruce came and saw one of our rough cuts of the film, and he was really impressed with the movie. He was like, this is great. Actually, he turned to us and he said something about, I remember he commented to somebody, he said, has this been submitted to the Oscars yet? We were like,
we didn't even have any flying footage in it yet, or not the stuff that we got in New Zealand. I mean, it was a very rough cut, but yeah. We were.
So he was, and then later on, after we saw that rough cut, then later on when we were casting for our narrator, his name was on the list, and after the whole process of finding someone, he ended up being the person who was available and interested and did the job for us. So that was quite amazing.
Hoping he was going to do it for free or at a discount because he loved the story, but his agent drove a very hard bargain, but it was worth it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Wondering, with the $25,000 initial grant, when did you realize you needed more, and then how did you end up how did you end up getting more funding? What was your process?
Well, we knew we needed more, and we got to know 2 grandsons of the first Yale unit members, Harry Davison in Manhattan and Mike Davison in Atlanta. They're cousins, and share a grandfather, Truby Davison. And we asked them to be on our fundraising committee, and for I think 3.5 years, every Thursday morning at 6 a.m. West Coast time, we would talk to them about people they knew, foundations they might be aware of to raise money, and we wrote a lot of letters. And Ron and I, we'd go to the East Coast to interview people and do production and film planes or whatever we do, and then we'd go to New York and we'd show what we had at the Dolby screening room there and try to get people to write checks for us. And we'd get $100 here, $100 there, and it just really wasn't doing it. But Ron started writing a quarterly newsletter, and we started collecting email addresses and sending this out and letting them know it was going, and gradually it got out to more and more foundations. We learned that there was a level of money and foundations that you don't really hear about, but that wealthy families, have to give away X amount of money every year for tax purposes. And so there were people that had some relation to the story, whether it was through Yale, whether it was through the Navy, or whether they just wanted to hear see a patriotic story being told. And we kept trying for a corporate sponsor. We worked on J.P. Morgan for for over 2 years, because originally Truby Davison, the young guy who founded the unit, his father was J.P. Morgan's business partner. And J.P. Morgan had given the first Yale unit $100,000 to get started and buy airplanes. And so we knew some people working at Morgan, and we went to them and said, we'd like the same amount of money adjusted for inflation. And we were asking for $200,000, but all that time we were working on it, every week in the news, there'd just be horrible reports about their corporate behavior and Jamie Dimon, and they've done this and they've done that. But you know, we still wanted the money. We still kept trying to get it. In the end, it fell through. And I think sort of out of embarrassment and kindness, they gave us $25,000, which helped. But in the end, our corporate sponsor was FedEx, and we had been wanting to go to them for a long time because Fred Smith, the founder, went to Yale. He started the Yale Aero Club, and I think he was a Marine, but he flew with the Navy, I think in Vietnam, or at least during Vietnam. And so we were all but sure he'd be aware of the story, and indeed the story was something that really meant something to him. He was also a member of Skull and Bones, the way probably 5 of these first Yale unit guys were as well. And so in the end, they came through with the last $150,000 that we needed to finish the film.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the other little bit on fundraising that I'll mention is that our fundraising was always driven by necessity. So it wasn't like we were just trying to raise money randomly for, to say, oh, we would like to raise, $250,000, something like that. It never was like that. It was always based on necessity. So as we were developing the script and we started editing, we'd realize there was a big chunk that we needed to go somewhere to film, or a group of people that we needed to interview. And then we budget for those particular parts of the film. So we had an overall budget for the film, but as we went along over those 7 years, we kind of did mini budgets where we said, oh, we need to do that particular shoot. How much is that particular shoot going to cost? Okay, it's going to cost, and we break it all down, travel, whatever else was involved, and then our fundraising efforts would drive toward fulfilling that particular chunk.
So in the newsletter, we would say we need $25,000 to film a Sopwith Camel, or we need $20,000 for our composer. Right. Those were 2 things that we really put out there, saying this is the next big thing we need, and we would be out of money, at each of these stages.
Yeah.
And this was a quarterly newsletter, you said that you...
It was intended to be a quarterly newsletter, and most of the time it was quarterly, but a couple times it was off schedule, but generally it was a quarterly, yes.
So I find that fascinating. So you would weave in like your own stories or different things, and then you also had information on what was next for the final part of the film.
As a matter of fact, the first thing that we did before we even started fundraising seriously was that we actually put our website together first, which was kind of a little weird way of doing it, and what we did as part of our website is we put up the imagery that we already had, and we started to create kind of a historical online museum, as it were. And the website that we first put up is actually still up there today. But that gave us kind of somewhere where our potential contributors, followers could go and see, what we were about and what we were trying to do over time. And then as people got on the email list, that there was the added outreach with the newsletter.
Actually, the very first thing we did after we put together the nonprofit organization and got our board together, which were friends of ours, is Ron and I put together a PowerPoint presentation of what the story was, and they all fell asleep.
Oh no! Was this at like some type of a mixer or something?
No, it was at my house, and here's the story, and I had plied them with wine, and that
was the problem.
They all fell asleep. Yeah.
Well, no, you work in IT, right? So, or computer science. So you've put together the website, or?
The first iteration of the website, I probably sketched out. We eventually did hire a programmer to help us with it. But as far as my IT work, I was a computer trainer for a number of years, so I did have a lot of background in that area. So I've been able to handle a lot of the technical stuff. I'm not really working in that field now, but yeah, I was for a number of years.
Oh, I see. Well, it helps so much to have some, I don't know if you could do your own WordPress site or whatever it was, but
right.
I know that's half the battle is,
yes,
is getting
exactly.
all that going.
But luckily, I mean, just a side note on that is that the tools have gotten so much easier to use today than they were 15 years ago in terms of putting up your own website. I mean, like you said, WordPress, and there are many other, kind of pre-formatted, templated versions of things that you can quickly do it. When we were doing the Millionaires Unit website, they weren't quite to where they are today, so that's why we got a programmer involved. But yeah.
The budget was, in the end, $1 million?
In the end, yeah, in the end it was $1 million. Fred Roos, our advisor, we met with him early on, and he said, "So you're talking about $1 million picture?" I said, "Oh, no. I think $350,000." And I remember thinking it'd be about 2 years, maybe 2.5 years. But because of the fundraising and because the movie kept getting bigger, it took us 7 years. And in the end, Fred was exactly right. It was $1 million. Yeah.
I mean, I would think that our film, for the budget that we ended up spending on it, was probably a big bargain because, we did a lot of the shoots with very, very small crew, like in some cases, one person. And then when we did get to New Zealand, we were flying with helicopters and airplanes and all of that. Everybody who was involved in that gave us lots of discounts. So, I think it's more of a $2 million movie that got made for $1 million. That's the way I like to think about it.
But in the end, what did that teach you about raising money for a movie? Because I know, looking back on it 7 years prior, do you think you actually would have said yes to it, knowing it wasn't just going to be a few years, it wasn't just going to be 300,000 and all that's gone on? Do you think you would have said yes?
I've often wondered about that because it would seem very daunting. But the film grew in such an organic way, and really, we never flagged. I mean, there were some times that were discouraging, and sometimes we were just out of money and nothing was really happening. But, having a partner, passing the ball back and forth, and I was always interested in the next thing we were going to do. I mean, and we learned so much. I had done documentaries for television, but I had never done the whole thing soup to nuts myself. And from the research, which I really love, and the writing, to actually shooting airplanes. And I went to Europe for 5 weeks and shot there, and went along the Western Front and over the English Channel. And then the movie just kept getting bigger and bigger and more exciting. And so there'd be another hurdle. And I don't know, we always felt up for it.
Yeah, I mean, my sense throughout making the movie was it was one of those ones of sort of focus, and also never taking no for an answer. It's sort of like you have to be so dedicated that people are telling you, no, you can't do that. You're never going to be able to do that. And you basically, in your own mind and in your own spirit, you basically say, yes, I can do that, and I'm going to do that. You know what I mean? So it's one of those things of believing in the project and that you will accomplish it and finish it. That was always there. Even when we were at the low points that Darroch mentioned, there's still this thing that's saying, this movie is going to get completed. We are going to finish it. We're going to follow through. And I think that if filmmakers keep that sort of mindset as they work on their films, it will get you to where you want to go. You just have to believe that it's going to happen and keep following that vision.
And it is persistence. It really is just showing up. I mean, there were times when Ron and I would fly to New York, to meet some people, to go to a dinner party, and come back with nothing. And but the cumulative effect of being there and going on, and having a bit to show for the effort you put in, finally pays off. And again, as I said earlier, the film evolves, and it often documentary filmmakers get setbacks and they don't have the money to edit or continue the film, but that time allows the story not only to grow and maybe change, but also to gestate. And then you come up with a much fuller and richer film.
Yeah, and the other piece for young filmmakers or other people starting out is, I would just say, start making the movie. It doesn't matter, like if you have one picture and you're making a documentary, make a 30-second video with that one picture with a voiceover and maybe a little bit of music behind it, but demonstrate that you can actually make something. Because that's the thing that worked for us. We made little pieces of the movie over time. And we would show those pieces to people, and then people would finally say, oh, you guys can actually make a movie, as opposed to just pitching an idea. Because you don't have to have a lot of resources to make a very simple piece that will speak to your vision and what you're trying to do. So start making the movie. That's my suggestion.
I completely agree with that, and there are two schools of thought about that. I've worked on other projects where they said, no, we should get all the money together first, and and then we won't be left hanging, and we'll know that we can do this. And I think you have to prove yourself. I mean, I don't know. Ken Burns doesn't have to, or very experienced filmmakers, but documentary films are curious individual projects, and they often don't work out the way you've originally thought. And so, I think it's important to start working.
And sorry, how far were you into the process when you actually got FedEx on board as a sponsor?
FedEx, the story with FedEx is that we were 6 years in.
Wow.
We got an invitation to screen the film at Oshkosh, which is the largest air show in the United States. And we said yes to that, even though we didn't have a finished film. And we didn't have the finishing funds either. So this was one of those times where we said, yeah, we'll be there, we'll have the movie, we can screen it. And then we were like, okay, how the heck are we gonna do this? So
let's call Fred Smith.
So that's when finally our fundraising team broke down and said, yes, let's. And we had been trying to reach out to FedEx over time, but finally it broke through right at the moment that we needed them. And they came in at the very last minute to save us, basically, so that we could finish the film for Oshkosh.
So again, showing up. It sounds like you were planning to go there regardless.
Yeah.
Even if you were going to show a little trailer.
We made the commitment, but
Right. Yeah. Interesting.
But they helped us out at the end.